served as the director of the Center for Ag and Rural Development at Iowa State since 2013, and she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. Kathy was actually on the program for my first water conference in 2013, so we were just laughing. We almost picked her 2013 talk off of her flash drive, so hopefully you have some great new information to tell us, and I know that you do. So let's welcome Kathy.
Yeah, that was, you just keep adding to these flash drives and one after another. So, but the good news is this is an extremely different talk. And I just found out that Rick Cruz bailed. I was going to give him a very hard time for putting an economist on the program at 4:30. And I think he must have suddenly realized how appalling that was, and he's left town. So he's not even here to take the blame for you guys having to be here for economics this late in the day. No, I guess he had to run somebody to the airport. But okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about something quite different than what I've had the opportunity to talk to this group about before. This is a project, a small project that is joint with my colleagues Chuan Tang, Gabe Lade, Dave Kaiser, Youngji Ji, and Jimmy Schur, all who are part of CARD. We were really fortunate to get funding from the Iowa Environmental Council and the Walton Foundation, and then combine that with some funding from USDA and other things like us researchers always do, in order to get funds for a couple of postdocs. Chuan and Jimmy are two of those postdocs, to come to Iowa State and work with us on water quality problems and water quality issues. So this project was an effort, is an effort, a very first rough, high-level effort to start to think about the benefits of doing and implementing conservation practices, particularly those sets of practices or practices like those that would come out of the nutrient reduction strategy. So I'm pretty sure this audience is very familiar with the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. I've already heard it mentioned 2 or 3 times earlier in the very few sessions I was in. That strategy has been a really important roadmap and plan for Iowa in thinking about how to deal with nutrient issues. When the team put that together, they did a really nice job of thinking about both the sets of practices, their effectiveness, and some rough estimates of the costs of those practices. What they didn't do, and it wasn't their specialty, this is not a criticism at all, but what they didn't do, and remains to be thoroughly done, is to think not just about the costs of those practices, but also the benefits. And so this is a first shot at starting to categorize and think about what some of those benefit categories are, what data is available to start to think about monetizing to the extent we can those benefits, and importantly to identify the lapses in data and things that we really have a long way to go before we can really fully look at the question of benefits. So I'm going to talk about 3 categories of benefits. The first one has to do with drinking water. And again, this audience is very familiar with the fact that this has been very much in the public domain in the last few years with the lawsuit from the Des Moines Water Works, issues and discussion related to removing nitrates from our drinking water. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is some summaries and data collection. What we have done with lots of help from other folks to point us to data and collect that data, just to get a basic picture of where Iowans get their drinking water, how much is from wells versus surface water, how many public water supply systems there are, and so on. So an introduction to the sort of the landscape of where Iowans are getting their drinking water. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know, which is kind of sketchy, about some of the costs of taking nitrates out of drinking water, and kind of try to, again, paint a picture of really what data do we know and what are we still missing. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about recreation benefits potentially associated with implementation of the practices in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And finally, I'm going to talk just very briefly about some discussion that is in the epidemiology literature and health literature about other sources of possible health concerns associated with nitrates in our drinking water besides the sort of blue baby syndrome and things that really aren't much of an issue anymore. So that's the roadmap of where I'm going, and here we go. I thanked lots of people. I know a couple of the funders from the Iowa Environmental Council are here, so we appreciate their support. As I said, the Walton Foundation, and then a bunch of USDA NEFA grants have helped put this together. So I am not an expert on drinking water, on infiltration, on geology. Simpkins is here. If you got questions, we'll call on him. There are others in the room who are, but just to get the audience up to the level of understanding of an economist of how this all works, let me do my best to explain what I've come to learn about drinking water and where these sources come from. Okay. Again, people in this room are, I think, pretty familiar with the fact that nitrogen and phosphorus are essential inputs into producing corn, soybeans, and many other crops. They're very valuable. There is no question that they provide a lot of value added in agricultural activity. However, they also act as a standard in economics parlance. I'm getting a little economics in here. As a standard externality. And externalities are a term we use that simply describe a situation where the production of something, in this case corn and soybean, leads to an external damage, an external effect that is not intended by the producer. It's a byproduct. Nonetheless, it is costly and imposes damages. Water pollution is a classic example of an externality. Air pollution is a classic example of an externality. Again, this is not intentional. Nobody is meaning to put excess nutrients in waterways and cause eutrophication or any other problems. It's just a side effect of them doing their job as a producer of agriculture. The extent to which agricultural nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, end up in particularly our groundwater, but our surface water as well, depends on the soil types, it depends on slopes, and it depends on the geology. Okay, so here you've got, we'll be talking about the different types of geology through which we get movement of nutrients from the surface into groundwater. Again, I think you guys don't need more of the sort of ag motivation. So, as I said, there are different types of geology that make nitrates move in different speeds and different depths under our soils. Alluvial aquifers, karst, shallow bedrock aquifers, and shallow drift aquifers are all present in Iowa, and they all have the capacity to move nitrates, unfortunately, from surface into groundwater supplies. So a slightly more technical picture of what those look like. Alluvial aquifers are sandy and more shallow. You have karst, and then you have examples of the other. The way in which nitrates moves through those into the groundwater differs, but in all cases, it can in fact move through. It's kind of the point for this purpose. Okay, I got a map of Iowa up here, and this is a map of the about 1,850 public water supply systems. In my slides, sometimes that'll be abbreviated PWS. I tried to keep abbreviations to a minimum, but you're also trying to keep not so much junk on the slides, so PWS are public water supply systems. There are about 3 million people that live in the state of Iowa. 2.8 million of them rely on publicly provided water, public water supply systems. The map indicates by color coding distinctions between community water systems, which is basically what it sounds like. It is a water system that supplies clean water to a large community of people. We then have non-transient non-community, and transient non-community. And those are just different categories of public water supply systems that tend to be smaller. They may not operate year-round. That might be, for example, schools, other things that are not all necessarily year-round activities, but they are all considered public water supplies, and therefore they are all regulated under the federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Of this set in Iowa, about 90%, 92% get their water for drinking water from groundwater. Hence the previous slide talking about groundwater and the importance of the geology in terms of what ends up in that groundwater. So about 90% of the systems take groundwater, but only about 55% of Iowans get their water from public water supply systems that rely on groundwater. Those look consistent, except that they are, because the largest and large water supply systems come from surface water. So of the 1,850, a bunch of them are small. The bigger ones, a number of the really large ones, do take their drinking water from surface water. So about 55% of Iowans get their drinking water from surface water through these public water supply systems. Okay, that's question one. Where are the public water supply systems? And we'll turn to private wells in a bit. But first, more on water sources for drinking water on the public. What you see on the right are two slides that show exactly the same data. This is data on the number of violations of nitrates from those public water supply systems from 1980 to basically the present. And I apologize for the minuscule little numbers on the thing there. 1980, year by year. The Safe Drinking Water Act has established a 10 milligrams of nitrate per liter drinking water standard. As long as you're under that, you are meeting the standard, and there is a belief, a scientific belief, at least that was in place at the time that that was established, that this was very safe for public drinking. The public water supply systems are required to test and report results of those tests periodically. The data that you see here are data indicating health-based drinking water standard violations. That is to say, violations of that MCL of 10 milligrams of nitrate per liter. At the top, the way that the data is sorted there is the kind of gold color is a community water system. Those are the big ones. Then the other two, the greeny colors, those are the ones that are more transient. They might be schools, things that aren't necessarily year-round. Okay, so that's just if you're interested in how this breaks out by, is it a community system or one of these transient systems. The bottom, again, is exactly the same data. You can see the height of the bar charts are exactly the same. The difference there is that they're divvied up by the size of the community or group of people that are drinking from them. So extremely, very large drinking water systems are red at that bottom, and the only red you can see is in, I know this is really hard, let's call it 1985. There's a small little red blurb there. Those large drinking water systems, public water systems, are exceedingly careful and do not violate that 10 MCL. There are violations, however, in some of the smaller sized systems. Those can both be community and transient and non-transient. Okay, so this is not being broken down by the type of system, they're just broken down by size. Very large is over 100,000 people are being served. Very small, I think, is like less than 1,000. And then there are different gradations there. point to be taken from this is when there are violations, they do tend to be at public water supply systems that are not serving very many people, which is good. If we're going to have violations, we want fewer people to be impacted, having to get their drinking water elsewhere, having to buy bottled water, and so on. Okay. That's sort of the snapshot of where Iowans who get served by public water supplies get their drinking water. There are, as I noted in that first slide, people that do get their drinking water from private wells. There are about 230 of those, which is roughly 8% of the Iowa population. This is a map of where those private wells are across Iowa. These wells are not, they don't fall under the regulatory control of the federal government. They are not mandated under the Safe Drinking Water Act to do regular testing. However, there is strong encouragement. There's a lot of DNR extension and outreach activity to encourage people. Sometimes there's support provided for test kits and so on. So people are very much encouraged to do this, and indeed a number of people do, although not everyone. The notable thing about that is sort of the empty holes of white, where you see that there are no or very few drinking water sources from private wells, and that's because there isn't a drinking water source that they can tap from. The wells, they don't have the kind of geology that allows them to get drinking water. And so they have to rely on surface water, and many of them would be associated with a community water system of some sort. To get a notion of what's happening to the nitrate levels in those drinking water from private wells, we took the data from the Private Well Tracking System, another acronym, PWTS, Private Well Tracking System, that is maintained by the Iowa Department of Natural Resource, and which is data from, as it says, more than 113,000 tests from over 58,000 residential wells from 1989 to 2017. So there's quite a bit of data over that period of time. What you see in the top of the parallel pictures here is simply a trend line fit to the average nitrate levels from all of the tests that came in each year. So in 2001, all of the drinking water from private well tests that came in are averaged around 3, and is clearly far below the 10 milligrams per liter requirement or standard. However, a couple things to note. First, there is an upward trend over that period of time, still well below on average, but the trend is increasing. At the bottom, you see a different sub-sample of that data. So even though there are the average over all those wells is well below the 10 MCL, there are in each year a number of wells that are in exceedance of 10. And that's what that bottom graph is showing you. So in 2001, despite the fact that on average the wells were tested at 3, there were, let's call it 11% of the tests that came back exceeded the 10 milligrams per liter. That level was around 12, 11, 10 from 2001 to 2007. A little bit of a spike up to say 16 in 2008, kind of level between 8 and 15, you know, a little bit higher, maybe 12, 13%, and then another spike, or at least a small increase, you can use the language you want, in 2016, up to 18% roughly of those private wells tested exceeded the standard. Now it's really important to understand what these data tell us and what they don't. They tell us that of the wells tested, these are the measures coming back, They don't tell us anything about the wells that weren't tested. Okay? They also don't tell us anything about what people were actually drinking. If people are testing, recognize that they're exceeding 10 and not drinking the water, buying bottled water, then these don't tell us anything of concern about health. They might tell us something of concern about expenditure, that families have to spend substitutes. If, on the other hand, people are still drinking this, then there may be health issues or concerns. But you know, this data doesn't really tell us that. And again, it's important to recognize our goal here was to start to collect data, understand what's available, what isn't, and start to think about, if we were going to do further work in this area, what do we think we should really be focusing on? And one thing I think we should really be focusing on is actual exposure of people. How many people are actually drinking water in exceedance? Or is this, when they are testing, is that doing a really good job, and what sort of fraction of the private wells are in fact being tested, and so that people at least know what they're drinking. Those are unanswered questions from our perspective. Okay. Another way to slice and look at this data, it's the same database, that private well database, but this is data just for 2016. What we wanted to do here is take a look at the relationship between the number of tests that come back above 10 milligrams per liter. I'll never get we don't speak that way in economics. We talk about like exchange rates and stuff, so the milligrams per liter does not trip off my tongue. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, 44. So for the year 2016, there are about 4,400 observations, and that's what that top left corner of the graphic plots. And it shows you, marked in red, are locations where there was a reported average above the 10 parts, and greens 10 and on below. What the other three pictures show you is the distinction for different depths of wells. So in the top right, we have what is referred to as high vulnerability wells, and these are wells that are less than 50 feet deep. Higher vulnerability wells, intermediate, are 50 to 150, and that's the bottom left here, and then the bottom right is over 150 feet, and those are low vulnerable because they're deeper and there's more chance, less of nutrients will get down and more processing along the way. What we find is, not surprising, there is a higher concentration of violations in the bottom right-hand corner. Of all of the violations, about 25% of the highly vulnerable wells have nitrate levels exceeding the MCL of 10. In contrast, only about 7% of the low vulnerable do. Well, that's invaluable and important, because if we were thinking about, as a state, where to target our efforts to do more testing, encouraging people to test, that tells us something about where our money might be best spent in identifying those locations where we're going to have more of the vulnerable populations. Okay. Well, again, that's just sort of a snapshot, our first effort to try to get a sense about at least what we could understand, and this may be most of this may be old news to some of you, but we got a sense at least of what is the water drinking, who's drinking from what locations, and what do we know about it. Costs. I'm an economist. We always want to think about costs. So if you are drinking water that has been treated to remove nitrates, that costs something. So we wanted to move into to try to get a handle on to what information is available on the costs of drinking water treatment, what options are available, and how much of that is occurring. So one common approach to treating water that has nitrates above that MCL is simply to take that water and blend it with water that is lower concentrations. And that is something that the Des Moines Water Works and other large water treatment facilities regularly do. Then, if that's not viable, not possible, if you don't have adequate water at low concentrations, there are two EPA-approved methods for removing nitrates. One is called ion exchange, and the other is called reverse osmosis. And from my way of thinking, this is magic A and magic B. Some of you in the room probably have a better comprehension of those notions, but there are two types of magic one can install on water, and with money and cost, you can remove the nitrates from your drinking water before you serve it to your customers. These are pictures of those two. So those of you who are machine geeks, there's some pictures of you for you. I want to put dollars in there, but nobody gets excited about pounds of money or something. Anyway, in 2016, we're using that year again as an example year, 50 of those 1,850 public water systems used either blending or some form of a nitrate treatment system. So that's kind of the scale at which some cost is being used to remove nitrates. And clearly, you expect that these systems they'll be using whatever is the cheapest way to get the nitrates out. That meant service to about 310,000 Iowans. So each treatment has its advantages and disadvantages. The key thing from drinking water and nitrates is that they can all work to get below that standard. How much do those systems cost? Well, the best we could find on data that was put together in sort of an aggregate, not just one individual. The One Waterworks is really great about sharing data, and other places are as well. But we did find a study that was done in 2012 by some folks at UC Davis that actually gave some pretty good estimates of the costs of these different systems to treat water. And so what I've done is circle that that column. The cost per 1,000 gallons treated varies depending on whether it's a small system or a large system. Because there's sort of some capital overhead on these things, you tend to get, there can be some declining costs when you get to large systems, but it doesn't always work that way. So on the right, those are just sort of the mean average cost estimates that run from $6 at small systems up to $1 and $2 for very large systems for those two different types. So that gives us some reasonable estimates of how much cost there is to those that are providing drinking water. Summary from this component of our report. There's 50 water suppliers that serve about 10% of the state's citizens that treat water for nitrates. So they are incurring some cost. They are doing what is going to be the least costly for them to assure what they believe is a high quality drinking water source for their system. But there is some cost being incurred for about 10% of the public water systems. Health-based drinking water violations are concentrated mostly in smaller systems, and they've decreased in recent years after something of an increase from 1995 to 2010. There is a cost of having nitrate removal systems in those public water supply. With respect to drinking water in private wells, about 7 to 25% of private wells may contain unhealthy nitrate levels. But again, that doesn't mean people are drinking that. That means that the tests that are being done are coming back at those levels. Okay, I'm going to turn now to the two shorter parts of our report, give you a little bit of background discussion of those, and then be happy to hear comments, questions, and your thoughts about what else we need to be doing in this area. So a little bit more, I want to talk about recreation value and benefits, because again, remember that the purpose of this work was to start to think about the benefits associated with the nutrient reduction strategy, and not think directly in this work about the benefits directly associated with the Gulf hypoxic zone. I know Nancy Rabley is here, and I heard she gave a wonderful talk last night. The nutrient reduction strategy was motivated in large part about what Iowa could do, the expanse and the conservation practices of what Iowa could do to reduce its contributions of nitrogen and phosphorus to the Gulf significantly, and the target is 40 to 45%. And the nutrient reduction strategy talked about the cost of those practices. Here, our goal is really to start to think about the categories of benefits that could accrue from those practices and those benefits that would accrue here in Iowa. So in addition to what they would do to reduce the hypoxic zone, they would reduce costs of drinking water, nitrate removal, and they would also have benefits associated with recreation. So that's why we took a look a little bit at harmful algal blooms and eutrophication and nutrient problems in lakes and rivers here in Iowa. This is a nice graph that demonstrates, or just plots for you, the number of beach advisories that DNR has posted since 2006 based on harmful algal blooms. We started in 2006 with around 20, dropped off precipitously in 7, 8, and 9. Those have been increasing 10, 11, on up to 15 and 16, and a big drop in 2017. Harmful algal blooms are caused by nutrients in the waters, but they also are influenced very much by rainfall, weather, and temperature. This picture is not a picture or chart of harmful algal bloom outbreaks. This is a chart of beach advisories posted for harmful algal blooms. Again, those are different things. These are things that occurred, and DNR felt it was important to warn people. There could be plenty of other blooms occurring in other times and other places where such a beach advisory wasn't necessary. And again, this doesn't indicate that anybody was harmed, but it does indicate that there was enough concern about the harmful algal bloom that there could be a health risk if people were to swim in the water. And I'm going to sneak some more economics in here. Cover your ears if you don't want to hear this. It's after 5 o'clock. The economic value of recreation is something I and my team have worked on a lot. And we have focused heavily on the economic value of recreation in Iowa's lakes. The session that was in here just before me, Grace Wilkinson had a picture up of the Iowa lakes, in which she's continuing to do the work that Downing and others have done of monitoring for the DNR, nutrients, phosphorus, and other things that occur in the lake. And I was really pleased and happy to hear that they're starting to monitor for microcystin and other sorts of harmful algal bloom, algae problems. So that's a great addition. Using that data in conjunction with work that we've done collecting information from households, we have estimated over the years the value that Iowans place on improving water quality in our lakes and streams. The lingo economists use is willingness to pay as our measure of the value, the money measure of the value. This concept, willingness to pay, is exactly the same as the kind of benefits concept used for all other goods and services. I should have done that. I should have poured the water first. Sorry. I'm just trying to drag out the economics part. Okay, see if that works. When the federal government does benefit cost analysis, which it does a lot of, and is required to do by federal mandate on all major projects, it uses the concept of willingness to pay to measure benefits. That applies to water quality improvements. It applies to greenhouse gas reductions. It applies to air pollution. It applies to health. It applies to the value of education. It applies to everything. This is not a new concept. It is not a concept relevant just for water quality. This is the concept of economic value and economic benefit. The way we measure benefits to people is we think about how much would they be willing to pay if they absolutely had to for this glass of water versus do without. So right now, I was about to choke and embarrass myself in front of you all. So I would have been willing to pay 20 bucks for someone to run and get me a water. How much did I have to pay? Nothing. My willingness to pay was 20. I had to pay 0. I had $20 of net value associated with this glass of water. That, in a nutshell, is the concept of willingness to pay. It is not what you pay. It is not the number of jobs created. It is not the cost of fishing supplies, Coca-Cola, or all of those things are an economic activity. That's important. Not saying that's not important. What I'm saying is that that does not measure the benefits of a glass of water, water quality improvements in our lakes, air quality improvements. What measures the economic benefit of those is conceptually what is the maximum we would be willing to pay if we had to, rather than do without. So in the water quality context, it's what's the most we would be willing to pay to get improved water quality in our lakes rather than have it at the current level. Okay? How do we go about getting those numbers? Well, one way we go about getting those numbers, and I'm going to present you a number today, is based on observing people's behavior. In the state of Iowa, the DNR has identified about 130 lakes that are important public lakes in the state. There's a map of them. What we have done is combine the water quality data associated from the Limnology Lab here at Iowa State with answers to surveys we sent out to households all across the state of Iowa. We've been doing this for a number of years. In 2014 was the most recent year we've done it, and that was with support from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Thank you very much. We collected survey results from, I think we had about 4,000 responses. Our goal is to characterize the households around the state, not to get basically a representation of all Iowa households. We find out how many visits they took to these lakes, which ones they visited, how often, and then we collect information about their income, how many kids in their family, what kind of car they drive, and so on. We use that information to infer statistically, and here I'm not going to give you a bunch of math and statistics, but we use statistical models to infer how much further people drive to get to cleaner lakes, holding as much else constant as we can. Okay, so the thought experiment is we observe people deciding where they want to go recreate. We have ample evidence from this data and other studies that have been done by researchers around the country that people will drive further for better water quality. We use that intuition to infer if we could improve the water quality closer, how much people would be willing to pay to have those improvements. That gives us benefit numbers, monetized benefit numbers that are appropriate for use in something like a benefit cost analysis. And when we've worked with DNR, and they've been incredibly great here in Iowa, they want to know these kinds of things. They want to know about where is a good place to invest funds for Iowans. The way we explain this is, if you're thinking about using taxpayer dollars, where do you want to invest them? At least one of the things you want to consider potentially is where you're going to get the highest value to people in the state for what you spend in lake restoration projects. This is exactly how a benefit cost analysis would be done. Okay. Having said all that, what do we find? We estimate, using these statistical models and that data, that if we were to take all of the 130 lakes in Iowa, and if they had less nutrients, 40% roughly, and if that's what came about from implementing the nutrient reduction strategy, that would yield $30 million to Iowans each year in water quality benefits. They would be willing to pay $30 million per year to see those large increases in water quality at the lakes in our sample. Okay? And I already mentioned the harmful algal bloom point. Finally, and super shortly, the other thing we wanted to start to get a look at, and this was mostly just to educate ourselves, is what do we know about health risks? So blue baby syndrome is something that I imagine most people here have heard about, and it's a case where children get too much nitrates early in their life. And it can be extremely dangerous. Very high concentrations. It can cause brain damage and even death. This was found in Iowa in 1945. It is gone. This doesn't happen anymore. Okay, the only blue babies we get are the ones that are filled with blue frosting. Okay, so that's very happy news. That's the sort of thing where a problem was seen. There was an understanding from science of how to fix the problem, and things like those MCLs are based with safety measures to avoid that. Okay, so we don't want anybody to think that we're running around screaming that there is a fire. Since 1970, there has not been known reported cases of blue baby syndrome. Plus, it's just a cute as heck picture to put up at 5:30 at night, right? I couldn't believe nobody went, "Aw, okay, you guys are tired." Okay, however, there does seem to be some evidence, and the science here seems to be quite unclear. There's important work that's been done at the lab in Iowa City as well as elsewhere, that there may be, even at low levels, the low 10 or in the area of 10 milligrams per liter of nitrates, there may be some long-term health risks associated with bladder and gastric cancer, possibly reproductive difficulties, health defects, and so on. Again, this appears to be, from my read, and I'm not an epidemiologist, that there is need for more analysis, there need for better understanding. We need more data, more samples, and we need to understand what are people actually consuming, not just what is in the wells and in the areas around them. So that's it. This is our list that we came up with of what we think are key areas that additional knowledge and research are needed. Maybe I'll just mention them real quick, and then I'll open it up for your comments, questions, and comments on the list. That first point I've repeated a couple times, that a problem of attributing nitrate exposure to health outcomes is we don't know the exposure necessarily. We know that they have the test in their private well exceeded, but we don't know whether they were actually drinking that. We don't know where people are getting their drinking water from. It seems obvious to us that we should continue to study that, get more information. There's a lot of complicated interactions that scientists still need to sort between nitrates and other contaminants on human health. So this is, so far, what I talked about is just nitrates. There's starting to be some discussion of other sorts of things that are in our drinking water. And while we've learned a lot, there's plenty still to be learned. So I'll stop there, and thanks.
questions for Kathy? We have a couple minutes. Yeah.
The trend line and then the total at 2017.
Yeah.
Is there a known explanation for that?
It's not known by me, but who's in DNR here who is there somebody that can explain that? The beach advisories in 2017 were much smaller than the trend before had been going up. Does anybody know why?
I'm curious if the monitoring is
Susan, go ahead.
The monitoring is the same, but I think you mentioned when you showed us slide that the weather patterns, when the rain occurred and then the temperatures had a lot of influence on the number of algal blooms. So it's not just the pollution, but the other environmental factors. So you will see variations year to year, but in general, we have been having weather, a lot of rainfall in the spring, and we've been having hot,
Yeah.
High temperatures in the late summer, early fall, and that's when the algal blooms. So I think it's just different years. And so what we get next year maybe.
Kind of wondering about the geographic distribution of benefits. There might be some watersheds that deliver a lot of dimensions to the Gulf of Mexico, but maybe there aren't any large plants along that watershed that are gone, or along the river that are gone, or there may not be any lakes.
Yeah, that's a great question. What about the distribution of the benefits? Do those, say, $30 million all accrue evenly across the state or not? And as well as the costs for removal. And we didn't look hard at that. No doubt they're not going to be evenly distributed. For example, many of those benefits go to people that live in urban areas and drive to lakes that are near urban areas. Lakes that are far out don't get accessed a lot, and so water quality improvements there are not as valuable to people in economics context because they're not as heavily used. So short answer is, good question, I don't know, and thinking more about the distribution of who gets those benefits would be really useful. Yeah, and I'm kind of staring at the, I don't, are you watching who's, yeah, because I can't see who's.
You mentioned $30 million in benefits. I guess the nutrient reduction strategy was implemented, achieved 45%, but that was just for lakes. It doesn't include recreation on rivers or streams.
It only includes lakes, not rivers and streams, not ponds, not, it's absolutely. I massively, thank you so much for making that point. To me, that is obviously a lower bound. Yes, and we happen to have much better data on lakes than we have elsewhere, and so, but an excellent point. It is only recreation on those 130 lakes. All other water bodies that would be impacted are not included there, as well as a variety of other kinds of benefits that are not being captured from direct use. So for example, if it improves wildlife habitat, and that improves hunting and bird viewing and so on, that's not included either. So, and there's other benefits from the nutrient reduction strategy practices that are not included. Sequestering carbon, for example, wildlife habitat associated with some of those practices, and on and on and on. So, excellent point.
Thank you for the work you and your team. One of the takeaways that we thought a lot about at the council is that there's so much emphasis on this being an urban versus rural problem. But I think the study really helps point out that people all around the state are impacted.
That's an excellent point, and it links back to the question of who's bearing these costs and where are the benefits. And, you know, dicing some of this and thinking more about rural areas versus urban would be a natural thing to think more about. Yeah, it's a really good point.
I'll take one more question, and we have one in the back. I can't see there's light.
Great presentation. A point about degrades. It's also, high nitrates are also a threat for others. And one thing is it will back on the death of these children. And it's possible that there have been history of nitrates back. So I just look at that point that although
Thanks.
it's true that there has been a use of this for form-based, that may not have been the case for children.
Okay. Thank you very much. I did not know that. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for a drink. So let's give Kathy one more round of
Thanks.
applause before she goes.